And if we're recording now, good. And if we will have time at the end to also have dialogue with you, which we really want to make happen. So, Michelle asked us to do research that would not just add to the information bank, but that would add to the information bank in a way that would drive action. So, our title here is From Conversation to Action, and I cannot emphasize enough as you listen to these results, I would ask you to think about how can your organization, you personally, your community take action in response to what we're learning here. We did this in an effort to move beyond the existing body of research. We were not interested in replicating research that was already done, so we did a full literature review. We did a series of qualitative interviews to understand association community perspectives on welcoming environments and diversity, equity, and inclusion. We will use those terms somewhat interchangeably today, but understand we're really talking about welcoming environments. And then we went out with an electronic survey. As Jennifer said in her intro, we talked to more than 5,000 members of different associations, a range of them. We'll talk more about who those groups were, and also several hundred members of staff, because we gave the participating organizations the option for which audiences they wanted to talk to. And we will have voices of both those communities throughout the data. We were in the field in February and March of 2020, so just before COVID. And as Michelle said, before the murder of George Floyd and all that flowed thereafter. So that's an important piece of information for you to have. But what are the data? What do we know? And the first is to say, we've got problems. In the association community, we've got problems. And what do those look like? Well, let's start off by understanding that 44% of the members, so that's that audience of just about 5,200 folks, 44% have witnessed, experienced, or both harassment, bias, or discrimination in the last year. And you see the pie chart that spells that out a little bit more in terms of where they fall. Fully a quarter of those folks had witnessed or experienced those things within the last month. So there are very real experiences that people are having. Probably, we hear about it a lot, but I think to see, approaching half of members have experienced or been a part of witnessing these things is really concerning. I'll preview a data point that we're going to come to later, but nearly 4 in 10 don't know how to report or what to do in a situation when they do witness or experience one of these things. So it's not only that it's going on, but that people don't either know or feel comfortable taking action in response. That's concerning, for sure. So let's talk about inclusion. Michelle oftentimes says that it really all begins with inclusion. We talk about DE&I, and the I is at the end of that, but creating inclusive environments sort of sets the tone and tenor to begin with. That's welcoming environments, the whole premise behind it. But here you see 50%, only 50%, are satisfied the level of inclusion in their own workplace. So not in their association, but in the place where they work. But it's one of the most important criteria they look for when seeking an employer. More than 95% said a sense of inclusion was a critical priority for them in determining where they wanted to work. And yet, fewer than half are finding it. So, that's a real red flag for talent retention and satisfaction in workplace settings. The impact of harassment, exclusion, and discrimination is felt disproportionately by those who are traditionally underrepresented. So women experience it more than men. Millennials, the youngest cohort, experience it more than other generations. People of color, experience it more than whites, and people with disabilities experience it more than those who are differently abled. So, you know, it's out there, and it is disproportionately hitting those who are already marginalized in some ways. We have been reminded of this in the screaming headlines around health disparities, right, of late. And this is just another example of where we have real problems that we need to look at. And it's not rare. So, I experience a number of association, typically it's on the leadership side, who want to say, well, we don't have a problem with that. That might be elsewhere, but we don't have a problem. And um, this would suggest that there is occurrence in most organizations. So almost a third are impacted by their socioeconomic status on a daily basis. Uh, just slightly over a quarter impacted by their race or ethnicity on a daily basis, and 22% impacted by their age on a daily basis. And one thing that we want to acknowledge here is, these are just single criteria identities, but nobody has a single criteria identity. You have a socioeconomic status and a race and ethnicity and an age. And so the intersection of multiple identities mean that people are getting these impacts from all different angles. It's sort of coming at them from lots of directions. So so the occurrence is a real problem. Okay, so what about leadership on this? We heard very clearly from both members and staff that neither association member leadership nor association staff senior leadership are sufficiently diverse by significant margins. So there is a real leadership problem here, a perception of diversity in leadership ranks on both the member side and the staff side. That's probably not terribly shocking to the folks here today, but it does point out that there is an issue there that has to be examined in a serious way. So those are some of the problems that the research helped us identify, that it quantify, giving us evidence. As Michelle said earlier, we now have data to paint the picture in ways that we might have assumed some of that reality before, but now we have that evidence. And we have further evidence that we know better. In other words, the things that we're doing in response to the situations are in many instances not the most effective things or the most important things to be doing. So what do I mean by that? We presented the survey participants with a long list of things that could be done in response to diversity, equity, or to address diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I know the font is small, but the point is there's a long list of things, and we asked them to say, what's really important in supporting a welcoming environment? And these blue bars show the relative importance that you can see. The highest thing is have diverse speakers and presenters at conferences and meetings, creating clear opportunities for diverse members to participate in the association leadership, and on down. But then we ask folks to say, okay, this is important. What's actually going on in your organization? And these red bars show what the organization has really done. The delta, the gap between importance and activity is pretty startling in a number of these. I mean, you see these top ones around leadership opportunities for folks from diverse backgrounds, hosting events that foster welcoming environment. There's huge gaps there. So we are underperforming in some really significant ways. This tells us what our members believe to be most important for us to do, and it tells us that's not where we're spending our time effectively. If you look at the bottom of the list, you see a little evidence there of some things that folks told us are less important. events specifically for certain audiences and SIGs or affinity groups. And we're sort of overperforming or over emphasizing those relative to what people told us are important. This is a member's perspective. But we did the same exercise with staff, and we saw a very similar pattern. Again, the importance is higher than the performance on quite a number of issues and by quite a significant margin. The order of the priorities is somewhat different, but the gist is, again, we aren't putting our effort where our audiences are telling us it ought to be best directed. So that's the reality in the association world, but we wanted to also ask about in the workplace. So specifically, we asked members to talk about their places of work. And we saw really a very similar pattern. I mean, the graphic here is a slightly different format, but it's the same gap analysis distribution here. Real underperformance in the workplace. So associations aren't necessarily worse than the broader marketplace, but overall, what we're doing isn't really the most effective thing to be doing. And we have information here about what we should be doing. I'll talk more about what we should be doing in a moment. So what do we do? What's the response that is needed here? And the first thing is prioritization. Now, I want to acknowledge, as we've said a couple times, this data was collected just about a year ago. Maybe these answers would be different today. Anecdotally, it feels to me, I'm talking to lots of different associations, like they would be different. But what we heard very clearly is it's simply not an organizational priority, whether it's not in our strategy or it's not in our how we're spending our time, which are kind of the same, one would think. It was not coming up strongly enough. Certainly in a lot of conversations with groups now that are realizing that they need to pay more attention. I'll just kind of go off script a little bit here from the data to say, one of the things I've been kicking around with some colleagues is, how do we need to talk to boards about their responsibilities as it relates to welcoming environments? And I am of the opinion that while it doesn't carry the same fiduciary or legal ramifications as, the duty of care, obedience, and loyalty that we talk about when we talk about board fiduciary responsibilities, I believe there is a fundamental responsibility for boards to be thinking about diversity, equity, inclusion across the organization in everything they do. And it is my experience that it is not what the vast majority of boards have as their tradition or their set of practices. But that's what's going to be necessary to fix a data point like this that says it just hadn't traditionally been prioritized. We can talk about that because that may not sit well with everybody, and you may be thinking about your own leaders and think, wow, our folks are really they're in good shape on this. Others may be thinking, yeah, if we could get our leaders more on board, we'd be well served. So in addition to the prioritization, we need to look at the hiring pipeline. And this says from the staff perspective that finding qualified, diverse candidates is a real problem for 41% of folks. This is a data point that I have discussed vigorously with a number of folks since we released this data. And my initial response was, look, the majority of these organizations are based either in the Chicago area or the Washington, D.C. area. Are you really looking me in the eye and telling me you cannot find qualified, diverse candidates in greater Chicago and greater DC? That just doesn't square for me. But I had a number of HR leaders push back and say, we have been working on this for years and it is a real problem. To which I say, well, then we have a real opportunity in the association world to fix this, whether it is helping to develop qualified, diverse candidates so that they're available for employers, or finding better ways to connect the association community to the already established qualified, diverse candidate pools. Um, there's a gap here that's really problematic. So welcome conversation with you on this front, but that's an important finding here that I think just begs for attention and a response. Inclusion is really important here. And so you see a whole number of stats where members agree that inclusion is not happening in the ways that it should, at the times that it should, with the audiences that it should. And one of the things that is important about any conversation around advancing an organization's work in this space is you don't have to do everything at once. The complexities become overwhelming pretty quickly, and it's hard to know where to start or where to go next. And I think Michelle and I would agree that don't worry about getting the right answer, but do something. Get going. And inclusion is a really, really, really the correlation on working on inclusion and impact is really high. So it might be an attractive place to start. This is where that 42% of members don't feel comfortable speaking up if they see or experience harassment, discrimination, and bias. I previewed that earlier in the data, but you see it there. And even more than a quarter of staff don't feel like they have a way to speak up when they see or experience a situation like that. Boy, is that a problem. We also want to talk more about HR and another gap analysis slide. I want to be careful here to say to you, we are not suggesting that HR is the problem or that it's HR's job to fix these issues. What we are saying here is there are a number of opportunities through the HR lens to get at some of these issues. And so that's really what's going on here. But again, about importance and the satisfaction with organizational results related to it, we have pretty significant gaps here. So even on that angle, what we're hearing from the respondents is we've got a long way to go. We could do a lot better. And you see that, just that first one on equitable promotion and hiring practices or succession practices, a 60-point gap between importance and satisfaction is startling. So big stuff there. We did ask what people thought we should do, and I want to say that members and staff had a whole host of ideas on what the responses could be. And again, what's most important is just do something. We talk about the journey. We talk about there's a starting point and there's no end point, probably. Different organizations and different individuals are all different places, and there's no judgment about wherever folks are, but do something to take a step forward, or 2 steps, or 8 steps, whatever you think your organization can do. So let's pause and talk to you. But Michelle, let me start with you. What have your experiences been in talking to forum members and the forum community in the last year, as you and I have sort of been on the circuit talking about this data? But you have so many opportunities to hear from folks. What's on their minds these days?
What's on their minds is that welcoming environment allows them to have a different type of conversation related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's a more inclusive conversation. As I mentioned earlier, you can have courageous conversations that might, initially feel uncomfortable, but you first seek to understand. And for us, the research has, to your point, John, provided evidence that there are clear gaps and we have a lot of work to do. but it also provides input into strategic planning processes. It also provides topic areas for conversations with different populations of staff and members. And, as you mentioned, it's a matter of starting somewhere, right? Where organizations were paralyzed and didn't know how to get started. This enables them an opportunity to get started. When you speak to the fact 50% feel that, or what our research showed us, is they're not satisfied with inclusion, that's really concerning, because when you think about an association, in the fundamental definition of an association, a group of people join together for a common good, for a collective purpose, that totally goes against this. We have a lot of work to do. Half is that's just far too much. But again, we wanted to identify where are the opportunities, right? And then now let's equip our members with the tools and the resources to start planning for a more successful future in this space.
I just want to pick up on, now I had a chance to look in the chat window a little bit, and this isn't a direct response to the thread with Tony and Carrie, but I was talking to a large scientific and medical society yesterday, and they were sharing some stats around the gender profile of their annual meeting attendees. And so 2019, their last in-person annual meeting had about 50-50 male and female attendance. Last year was virtual, and it went to 60% female, 40% male. And, one of the questions is that's a huge shift, right, in 1 year. Is that about access? And the fact that whether it was more women didn't have funding to travel. This is a global group, didn't have travel to annual meetings. Is this around family commitments and folks couldn't get away? Don't know. It's it's an N of 1 right now. They're virtual again this summer. So it's going to be really interesting. But I think this whole, work from anywhere, meet virtually is an interesting lens to bring to inclusion. It certainly takes down a lot of traditional barriers, but it also potentially makes it easier for people to not get connected to a community, not get connected to the organization in the same way, just because they're not physically present. I'd love if others have thoughts or ideas around this, but I think there's going to be some interesting anthropological research done, I think, around what's the impact on inclusion from a pandemic environment last year.
Absolutely. We'll have to definitely consider that in our part 2, welcoming environment research. And for us, what I'm also hearing, more associations are being very intentional around inclusion. We know that if you send out a call for volunteers or for candidates, board candidates, sometimes you are likely to be more inclusive, but more times than not, that doesn't happen. So they're being more intentional about actively or cultivating a relationship proactively, but also intentionally seeking out diverse candidates to be representative of the membership. So it takes a little more work, but it is definitely delivering results.
I did a project with a large medical group that their governance was traditionally always competitive elections, and which basically for them ended up being popularity contests. I think that mostly what competitive elections end up being in the association world. Mm-hmm. And so they were really frustrated that they were not getting more diverse people through that process successfully. That about the only way to get women or people of color on their board was to slate them against one another and make them sort of fight it out in the election slating process. And they said this is not right. So we worked with them to do a governance review, which they thought might take 3 or 4 years, and ended up their members were so compelled by the diversity, equity, and inclusion lens applied to governance reform. They made changes in 6 months. They ended up with the most diverse board they'd ever had, and they're very clear it was because they went from popularity contest to intentional identification, outreach, and cultivation of different kinds of leaders than they had been getting otherwise. And, I'm not sitting here saying everyone has to blow up their governance, but you do have to be willing to look at things that are systems, because gosh, if this year hasn't taught us about how systemically we have baked in bias and discrimination to our systems, it's the only way to get it is to be willing to unpack it, whether it's how you select speakers or who you give awards to, or how your volunteers progress in the pipeline. It's huge.
And I think that this next generation will hold us accountable. When we think of the activities of last year and who the demographics of those that were protesting and asking for accountability, they will be in our organizations. And so when it is imperative for us to move from just the statements to action, because they are growing up during a very diverse period of time. And they will be expecting that from the institutions that they choose to work for. And so is very important that we have these discussions, and it's also important that not only having the discussion but actually demonstrating in action. And if we are not as successful, that's fine too, but at least we're doing something and we're showing some type of action. It's about accountability as well. So we want to hear from our audience here. John and I are having a great conversation.
Join us. I want to throw out a question. I don't know if this will have legs in this community, credentialing network or not, but I've been working with a group, very high profile group, that their membership is largely about recognizing accomplishment in their field. I mean, and credentialing isn't about recognizing accomplishment in the field, but it is certainly recognizing knowledge and abilities. And that organization is in a internal war around those that feel that we risk. I'm reporting. I'm not saying this is my opinion. We risk the caliber of our recognition by just taking people to be diverse, and others who are saying you cannot be looking me in the eye and saying that to me, and you cannot tell me we do not have diverse people who are really excellent and merit-worthy members of the organization. And I just think I run into this a lot, particularly in scientific or medical groups. It's like the quality of the science, the quality of the medicine. It's, this whole, we can only look at that. And so if there aren't diverse folks producing the best science, then they're not going to be, speaking or awarded or otherwise. Anybody bumping into that issue, and how are you working it through? Because I think it's a big problem. I mean, it's too convenient to hide behind we're going for the best, and so there's no diversity issue. So any traction on that? Anybody dealing with that at all? Maybe you're typing.
I'm curious, what about feedback reaction to the welcoming environment concept? And how do you see applying this to the credentialing sector? Anyone would like to share their insights with us? Does this resonate with you? How do you see CNG becoming more engaged in this? What type of conversations do you think you will be having tomorrow or later today as a result of having this, being exposed to this new knowledge?
Michelle, this is Jen. I'll chime in with some initial thoughts. I think similar to many things in the association credentialing world, there's an interesting dichotomy between the welcoming environment you can create with your staff and the welcoming environment that you can create or try to create with your members. And that's not often, unfortunately, that's not often aligned. I would say, you know, for us, our members are very different than our staff, and ideas and policies and processes that we would be willing, that we willingly embrace, we often find resistance from our members. And I think that's a great challenge. I'm making a comment without a solution, which I don't love, but I'm sharing what our experience is.
Why do you think?
Sorry, my name is Mihaela Gugiu. I represent the National Registry of EMT. I'm a psychometrics manager there. So I could share a little bit because we are a credentialing organization. So we've taken efforts, and we have a diversity, equity, and inclusion task force internal for the organization. And the organization is also has created this national group to try to address the issues of the diversity and equity and inclusion, especially since our members, as was said, they are, EMS tends to be mostly white and male. And we have two different issues. One is internally, we had a fellowship program, and we had this conversation and discussions about, well, we don't get diverse applicants for the fellowship, and therefore we cannot increase that, and increase it, even if we are trying to, because there are not enough diverse applicants for these positions. So currently we are in the process of trying to work with programs and trying to move down and say, well, maybe we need to figure out a way to sponsor, students and engage them from high school, to say, you can have a career in the EMS profession, and we can sponsor you to do an internship and then follow with a fellowship, at the National Registry, since we usually look at graduate students for these fellowships. So it's trying to move a little bit remove a little of the barriers and try to reach down, because otherwise it's really hard to work with this. And the other piece is, trying to communicate to our members and our stakeholders the fact that, maybe it's time for us to think broader, and it is time for us to really, and for them to take steps into increasing the diversity and to be more inclusive in what we are doing. So there's a couple of things that just stirred my, my curiosity based on the question that John asked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's lots of folks I'm talking to in the association sector who are trying to think about what can we do to, these are my words, not yours, Mihaela, but trying to influence the pipeline, the future, the funnel of folks into the profession. That's going to look different, but what can we do proactively? And, credit where credit's due. ASAE pioneered the DELP program, like, what is it, 15, 16 years ago now? I forget the number, but, and others have mimicked that, but I think others need to think about what can we do for our particular field or industry. And it is a little daunting. That is not typically a low-hanging fruit thing to stand up, but boy, is it important if we're really committed to the future and to having a different profile down the road. I just want to pick up on something, Bruce. I appreciate your comment about essentially data, and that we don't know enough about our certificates or our audience. I run into this conversation all the time. Look, we all have a CRM, but in many instances, a vast majority of instances I'm running into, there's little to no demographic information that's ever been collected. And certainly not much analysis of that data. And it very quickly becomes well, could we ask a race or ethnicity question? Well, how would people respond to that? Or, fill in the other demographic piece. But that's actually a really important place for a lot of folks to start, for the same reason that Forum wanted to do this research study. So we need data. We need to understand where we are if we're going to be able to set targets and try and move needles, if you will, for the future. So while it might seem like a sort of a common sensey thing that of course we have data, is most organizations need to do a little work and certainly a little commitment to starting to generate some data And again, I would say that's one where you don't have to have every piece of data right out of the gate, but just a few pieces, a few threads to look at and set some targets. So, Bruce, I don't know if you wanted to comment any more on that, but I think that's an important place to start. Not always easy, but in a place to start.
So I'll give an example of what Association Forum is doing. You know, we typically hear that you stumble into association management, right? It's not a career path that you proactively seek out. And so within the past year, we've established a partnership with a university called National Louis University. And National Louis University has a strong partnership with Chicago Public School System. Over 90% of National Louis University students are first-time college goers in their family, and over 75% are Latinx and Black. And we were very intentional about this partnership because we want to expose or introduce association management profession as a career path, and many had no exposure to it whatsoever. So we are now like this matchmaker with our members. So our members have an intern position available. So we match them with National Louis University. And there's a direct, so when we talk about the pipeline of talent, and we talk about being intentional, and when we talk about action, you just start somewhere. We believe over time we will be able to see results to this, but you have to be intentional about who your partners are, and when we talk and remove the barriers to entry, right? Because that's going to be critical for us to see success in this space. But I will also argue that we probably need to go deeper. We need to look at high schools and potentially elementary and such to speak to not just the opportunity for a career in association, but also just the mission of associations and how we advance America and speak to that whole social consciousness. So that's just an example of what we are doing. And another example I'll provide is that we realize that we have an opportunity to diversify our membership base. So we have created advisory councils. So we have a Latinx advisory council. We now have an LGBTQI advisory council and a BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color. And so when we are now looking for leadership representation, we are engaging the advisory council. When we're contacted regarding positions within associations, we're able to have a community that we can tap into. And also they can demonstrate representation within our association so for others to see themselves being members. So there's just a lot of, there's some opportunities out there for us to develop programs and communities and such for to demonstrate our level of inclusion.
I want to pick up, Carla, I see your question here around both privacy concerns and applicability globally of some of these categories. We have had good success being GDPR compliant and collecting demographic information to frame it appropriately and in the right tool, but you could do it and be compliant. So that talk to a good research designer and they can help you with that. You are spot on around race and ethnicity are really national constructs and they do not translate globally. So if you are with an organization that has international members, that becomes a problem because it doesn't, the traditional US constructs around race and ethnicity just don't apply. And our lead researcher on this particular study and I have done a lot of work to try and find examples, the UN, the World Health Organization, on and on down the list. Nobody's got solutions that really work on data collection of race and ethnicity on a global basis. So it's a challenge, but it doesn't mean we can't talk about it at all. It's just it's hard to get a good data set on that. because it doesn't translate right.
All right. Are there additional questions?
So this is Pam. I put in the chat a question. I just wanted to kind of hear from others. As certification organizations, we have eligibility requirements and we have maintenance or recertification requirements. What are organizations doing to kind of look through the lens of encouraging diversity and access and requirements? A lot of times, like for example, and of course, we go through the process of as credentialing professionals, we're using data to help support and provide rationales for the requirements. But many programs require, college degrees in specific areas or something like that. I guess I just want to hear from other organizations, what kinds of steps have they taken to review and look through their requirements in a way that maybe encompasses or encourages some of these principles.
Either they're shy or somebody's typing furiously.
All right. It's a great question, Pam. I wish I could answer, but I can't. We're not a credentialing organization, but it's a great question.
Yeah, and I was reminded both in preparation for today and also in some of the questions that have come along. I think it is important to think about what are the nuances around a welcoming environment conversation in different settings in the context of credentialing. What does that mean? What are the ramifications in meeting planning and that sort of thing? The different parts of the puzzle that are involved in our community. The core is the same, but the application or some of the nuance is important to think about. And potentially for future studies. I mean, I would shamelessly put this plug out or request out to all of you is, as Michelle said, we are hoping to do more research. And if there are particular questions or dimensions that you would love us to investigate, we're all ears. We really would love to know how we can meet your needs, because again, the reason to do this is to drive action. And if there are things that if you could know would help you drive action in your part of the portfolio, let us know that.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of responses to Pam's question just came through, so that's good.
Good. So it's about 9:59, and I think Jennifer, you think that we appreciate the time today.
Well, and we absolutely appreciate your willingness to share your time, your talent, your expertise, and your research. As John pointed out, there have been some responses that came into Pam. Pam, thank you for asking a question that made everybody think. That is always a good thing. But John and Michelle, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate your willingness to be a part of our organization and help us grow and do better. So thank you very much for that.
You got it.
Come back anytime. I've seen a couple of, can we do a part 2? So don't be frightened when we reach back out and say, hey, you want to come back on and talk to us some more.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you all.
Of course. Thank you. And to our attendees, just a few reminders as I get to the right screen. Our next event is May 5th. Of course, it will be virtual. And it's on Good, Great, and Greater, the successes from 2020. The registration for that is going to ask you to give us some feedback. It's going to ask if you want to tell your story. And I want to be clear that we're talking about your successes from 2020, because I think it's very easy for all of us to talk about what didn't go well in 2020 and not so easy, or we don't do so willingly talk about what went right in 2020 or what we did better. So that's what we really want to focus on in May 5th. and lessons learned and ideas that we can take from each other. There's going to be breakout rooms, there's going to be different topics, facilitated conversations. So pay attention to that registration when it comes out, because we'd love to have your feedback and your stories as a part of that. Before we close up, like any in-person meeting, we would have taken this opportunity to ask if there are any announcements. If you all want to unmute yourself or even put in the chat any announcements you may have, that could be anything from your hiring to you have a question, you need advice, you need anything like that. So before we wrap up, or do we have any announcements for the good of the order?
So Jennifer, I have one.
Great.
Yeah, so actually the International Board of Lactation Consultant Examiners, we're hiring a few positions. They'll be posted to, one of them is a manager position for exam administration and certification. And that's going to be posted to ASAE as well as ICE and ATP. And then we're also looking for a certification coordinator that is in the customer service side of things.
Excellent. Thanks, Pam. At CCIM, we are also looking to hire in our education technology area. We need someone to help support our LMS. So this would be considered, I would say, pretty entry level. So if you know someone looking to break into the association or credentialing world that is good with technology, please send that person my way. Anybody else with a job announcement?
Hey, Jennifer.
Yeah.
So,
Hey, Bill.
hey, thanks. So not to try to steal from, you know, your pitch to get someone over our side, but we're growing very quickly, and we actually have quite a few openings in the technology side. Of more interest to this group might be we really need some qualified account managers, client facing, people who love to serve our clients. Marketing manager and product manager, in addition to some others. So if anybody's interested, please reach out to me. I'd be happy to tell you more. Otherwise, we have a careers page on our website as well. So love anybody you can send our way.
Awesome. Thanks, Bill. I did see a question come in about a copy of the report or the slide deck. I am uncertain. I will ask Michelle and John if we are able to share. I do not have that slide deck. I will ask if they have any information that they want to share with the group, and if they can, we will definitely send it out in our thank you and follow-up evaluation. And if anyone is looking at sponsoring future CNG events, please reach out. We're more than happy to partner with you to help sponsor future events. Any other announcements? Awesome. Well, thank you for everyone's time and participation today. I thought this was a really great conversation, and I hope we continue to think about these critical topics in our own organizations. So thank you all and have a great day. Happy Thursday.